I'll actually give a perspective on like what kind of tactics worked for Hightouch in the early days on the inbound generating side. So I think we've done a good job at it, and I think there are some like learnings there.
In this conversation, I talked to Tejas Manohar, who is the co-founder and co-CEO of Hightouch, a $600 million startup that helps companies collect, prepare, and sync data into any ad platform, CRM, and email tools. Prior to that, he interned at HubSpot when he was only 15 years old and then got a full time job as an engineer at Segment when he was 16 years old. I had a very insightful and interesting conversation. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you so much for coming. I really wanted to have this conversation with you for such a long time. It's really impressive what you've done at such a young age. You interned at top startups, including HubSpot, worked at Segment, and now you have this impressive startup called Hightouch. So, working at both HubSpot and Segments, what lessons did you learn early on these startups that were useful for your career and for building Hightouch?
What a great question. Before I moved to Silicon Valley and I started working on startups and joined Segment, I think that I didn't have a full understanding of how much of building a company actually had to do with, uh, skills that are often labeled as like the business side, right? Sales, marketing, and scaling teams, right? And management and building really effective organizations. I think before I actually, when I was just an engineer growing up and just interested in programming and building apps and making, useful things, I never really had a full understanding of what it takes to take, a useful product and build a successful company out of it. And I think that's actually one of the big things that I wouldn't say I actually learned while working at an early stage startup before founding, because I think founding is very different in a lot of ways. But I got a lot of exposure to and appreciation for during my time at Segment. So things like the amount of time and effort it takes to make sure you're like hiring very well, and how much of a difference like good management of the team that you actually hire can affect their overall motivation and effectiveness and efficiency. Also just like how much time and effort it takes to refine how you sell a product or what you build, or figuring out the right distribution or the right way to find customers. Once you build a company, you kind of, hit this phase where your initial product is pretty solid, and, has a product market fit. Like at Hightouch, that moment for us was when you were able to sit on top of a company's data warehouse like Snowflake and had about 10 integrations that we could take data from and send them to you, like HubSpot, Salesforce, Facebook ads, tools like that. And the question becomes, this is pretty generically useful. I've sold it to a few companies so far that are in totally different industries. How do I find tons more? And there's a lot of thought and creativity and tactics and learnings that go into those areas. They're like technical areas in their own, even though they don't involve software or programming. And I think working at a fast growing startup gave me an appreciation for those areas of the business that helped me as I started to found my own.
That's very interesting. Can you dive a little bit in more into detail on, finding after finding this maybe product market fit with the initial area, um, how is that going through and finding these other, companies or customers that also find value in your product? How did that work out and how is the process?
Yeah, great question. So this might sound a little bit mechanical, but I think it is actually how we think about it at High Touch. Maybe it's because we come from like an engineering and product background too. But I see each of the other areas of the function of the company, right? Like sales, marketing, et cetera, as like figuring out another like product, right? Just like you have a product market fit, you find, some gap or some need that no other company is filling in a market, and you find the general customers, like types of customers, whether they're industries or size of companies or roles, like let's say you're selling to developers or data engineers or business analysts that, have that unsolved need and it's important to them. That is what makes a product market fit, right? What makes a marketing function work or sales function work is kind of the same thing, right? First, you have to find the concept fit. So in marketing, we all often talk about channel channel product fit or channel market fit, right? For selling a certain product, sometimes it's really useful to have a channel like salespeople selling that product. And maybe conferences are a good way to find customers for that product. For other products, maybe it's a self-service online type of flow that you can just sign up for and try it out like Notion. And then you build things like sales over time as a company. So we really looked at like the go-to-market part of the business, just like product, where we had to do that figuring out like, what's the right model for our company. And in the early days, it really comes down to, I guess, two things like pattern matching and then also just trying some stuff. So we found that uh, we found that at small companies, a lot of data engineers, which was our initial audience at Hightouch, data analysts and data engineers, they would just adopt different tools online in a self-service way. So one of the things we prioritized early on in our journey at Hightouch was just the ability for these people to just sign up online and try the product. What we started learning, both through anecdotal evidence as well as through looking at other companies in the data space, is to sell to larger companies using the product self-service isn't as effective because a lot of those companies have concerns around things like security and privacy and aren't willing to just connect some tool online to all their data warehouse. So then you take that learning and you're like, okay, we need to start building out a proper like sales motion here. We're going to prioritize that more over the other motion. And then once you have that concept fit, it's like a product market fit, just like you have to engineer the product, you have to engineer the go to market. Every sales call you're on after you get off it, you kind of reflect and you're like, what went wrong there? Like, what was effective, what was not effective. As you start to hire salespeople, you figure out ways to train them, right? Initially, that started off as like, we'll just join every call with them. Later, we started giving them the rope, like a bit of rope and, autonomy in the organization. And you start figuring out systems to make sure that you can still keep track and make sure they're, operating properly, just like you keep track of your products and, engineering systems, as well as um, meetings to, manage them and inform them of new learnings, et cetera, like a weekly call to practice demoing customers or a weekly call to review all the deals in the pipeline, et cetera. I think I think it just comes down to fundamentally like problem solving and curiosity to help with the idea generation side. So that's the way I break it down. It's like pretty similar to product and engineering problems. Like go to market problems are also pretty similar if you're able to decompose them. The biggest thing that you have to have is a lot of curiosity towards go to market to succeed as a technical founder, and can't treat it like it's going to be the easier part. If that makes sense.
Interesting. So let's jump back a little bit in your history. So, I mean, you have this, for me, crazy history where you got a job when you were only 16 years old. And I was watching some videos of you being interviewed. Um, I think you lived in Nashville or somewhere like that. Um, and there is an interview of even a younger version of you working, for the tech industry. Um, so you got a job in a uh, very well known startup at 16. And can you tell us a little bit about the story of how you end up getting a job at such a young age at a startup like that?
Yeah, great question. So the story goes back a little bit before the job, right? I was into programming and building websites and coding from a young age. I was exposed to it from a couple different ways. One, I remember I was just exposed to like things like HTML through a few ways. Like once I was saving a Word document and saw that you could export to that, and I was like, oh, what's that? Another time, like I have a family friend of mine who is always building games and stuff like that, and I just started to learn from him, like, what it takes to do that. But it was all, like, hobbyist stuff. I never really thought about programming when I was in, say, 4th through ninth grade, right, in a professional way. It was just building stuff for fun, maybe building stuff for my friends, building something for my school, which was unusual for, like, a student in Tennessee back then. It wasn't like the Bay Area or Silicon Valley where I was growing up, where that was commonplace and everyone's parents worked at technology companies, et cetera. It was unusual, but I never thought about it in a professional way. Then when I actually entered high school, I had an older sister who was preparing for she wanted to go down the pre-med track and medical school and stuff like that in the future. And as you all know, that's a difficult path academically. You need to got to get into good colleges and all that kind of stuff. So she was always on top of her stuff. And she, one summer was like, I'm going to try to do an internship, like shadow our like local family doctor for the summer. Just walk around, learn what they're doing, help them out a bit, etc. And I was like, hey, I should do something for the summer too. I don't want to do that. What can I do? I was like, maybe I can do something in programming or get a software job. And I started looking for all these different startups online, and I actually found this company in like a newspaper in Tennessee, in Nashville, where I was growing up, where it was talking about a startup that came from California to Nashville after doing an incubator in California called 500 Startups. And yeah, I just decided to reach out to them, sent a cold email, and said, I'm a ninth grader. I would love to like work at your company for free for the summer. And they were like, yeah, sure. Why don't we try that? And that's when I started to learn that the skills I was developing, just as a hobbyist, were actually valuable to the business world. And it wasn't just that it's valuable, but it was a lot of fun to be able to work with others and build something bigger like together. That was an experience that I didn't have as much, just kind of programming at home myself. So I really like that. The next summer, I did something similar. I sent a ton of cold emails and LinkedIn requests and ended up landing an internship at Hubspot, which was, again, only advertising college internships and stuff like that. But just by asking and by doing some tricks, like not putting my college on the resume when I submitted for the internships, I made a way to get in the interview process and ultimately get the internship. Later, I realized that it was possible to finish high school early and do a gap year. It's something I read about online. And I was like, that sounds exciting because I want to see what it's like to work at a startup in Silicon Valley. Because I started to hear about Silicon Valley through HubSpot and all these different places. And I figured out how to do that with my school. It's pretty relaxed in Tennessee. It's not the highest standard of education in the country, sorry. And Segment, while it's a brand name now, it wasn't hot it was a hot startup back then, but not everyone knew about it. It was still a newer company, right? It was only about 30 people, 20 to 35 people when I actually reached out to them to try to join the company at that time. And again, the trick that worked for me was a cold email. I knew that if I applied online, I'd probably get lost in the candidates. Like my profile was not as exciting. So I just sent a cold email to the CTO and he actually knew my profile, like didn't know how old I was, but he knew about me from some open source projects I contributed to and decided to interview me and eventually gave me the job. So yeah, I think a lot of it just came down to curiosity to find things online. Like I kept reading different blogs and Segment would put out a lot of technical blogs and open source projects. So just that curiosity. And then just taking a chance and like, sending cold emails, doing things that a lot of other people frankly wouldn't do or wouldn't think to do, putting yourself out
That's
there.
that's a awesome story, and I think it talks a little. I mean, it shows a little bit how agency, uh, having agency can bring a lot of opportunities. Um,
Yeah, that's a more eloquent way to describe it.
I've been thinking about this for a while, and it's not. I mean, it didn't come out, just out of nowhere. But having a high agency is really important.
For sure.
And
Yeah, curiosity and agency, like there's not really not much you can't do if you have those two things. And
that's
humility, I guess. Yeah.
yeah. Though there are a lot of people that are successful that are not so humble. So
That's true.
uh,
There's a lot of counterexamples there. Like, there's between outward humility and like internal humility of trying to learn more, etc.
yeah. Um, so let's talk about high touch. So how did the startup come about? How did the idea come about? If you had some experience in Silicon Valley and things like that, but how did the idea come about?
Yeah, great question. So it's actually a long story. When I first left Segment, believe it or not, my co-founder and I, Kashish, were working on a travel company. So we did YC for a travel company. At that time, I was like, I've worked 4 years in this data space and technical products, and I want to try something different. Um, and I think that would be interesting. And we did YC, we raised a seed round, but about 9 months after I had left my job, the world changed, right? COVID hit. This is March of 2020. And our metrics weren't the highest in the world. We were, in some ways, it was a blessing in disguise that we had to move away from the travel industry. I think that would have been a very hard company and product to build. Um, but uh, I've never seen anything like it where your metrics just go to zero in 1 week when the US quarantines were released around like March 5th, March 8th ish timeline. And at that point, we had to decide, are we going to just wait this out or are we going to do something else? And we were already thinking of other ideas within travel, but COVID gave us the opportunity to think out of the box and just be like, let's think of ideas outside travel. And, contrary to popular belief, it wasn't a straight shot directly to Hightouch. From even though I worked at things like Segment in the past, we started with some other ideas in the customer support space, with a very data centric angle of like, how do we help people in customer success and customer support teams to serve their customers best by knowing everything about them, to like building this internal customer dashboard. That's something we saw a lot of SaaS companies build is like an internal UI, or even non-SaaS companies like a DoorDash build these internal UIs to see everything about a customer for support teams and success teams and different teams around the company. We started building a SaaS software to abstract stuff like that. And then over time, we learned a few things from our customers, and I'm oversimplifying, but we heard a few things from customers that led us to have a realization that we should focus on high touch. Um, One thing that we heard from our customers was that, hey, all my data is in these new things like data warehouses like Snowflake, and I'm pulling up in stuff like Looker. Another thing that we heard from customers is that I have different SaaS tools, like Salesforce, like HubSpot, like Marketo that I bought for different business functions. So people just kind of started telling us, like, can you just help us move data from your the data warehouse into these different software systems and around my company for different business functions. So those business teams can have all the data they need to do their job. And before we were building something cooler, it wasn't just like a pipeline or an integration product. But we decided to take a step back and say, hey, customers are asking us for this. And it's a simple solution to a big problem. And it might be a good way to start building a company and build more of our vision over time. So that's sort of how our initial product, Reverse ETL, came about, which solved a kind of unique thing in the market, which was that there's a lot of companies who have a lot of data in these data warehouses. They're analyzing it in tools like Looker or Tableau or different BI tools, but that data is not accessible to so many of their different business teams and business workflows that are happening in different systems like Salesforce, HubSpot, Facebook ads, etc.
Interesting. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So being really close to customers really helped you out on figuring out this sort of problem and a simple solution that solved to many customers.
Yeah, and I would
Um,
say it was not being too held in some of our original ideas or original like vision of how the product should look. But just being confident in like what is the customer pain point, which is that customers don't have access to the right data. Like companies, like users in companies, in sales teams, and customer success teams, and marketing teams, they're all struggling to access their data and then just listening to our customers in terms of what the ideal product may be and just being super fluid and iterating there. I think we had some advantage in not holding our ideas so strongly because we had a forced pivot for our company from the travel industry to something else. So we were open minded. I mean, we were basically just a few friends like working in in an apartment at that point, and didn't have much else going for the startup. But I think it's something that I actually tell, early stage founders frequently too, is like, hey, don't be too strong. Don't hold your ideas too strongly. Like have vision, have ideas, brainstorm, but like, listen to your customers and adapt quickly.
that makes sense. And I guess you went through YC and raised a seed round, but how was your experience later on raising money and building a startup at such a young age? Did the work at HubSpot and Segment help you or teach you something there?
Yeah, great question. Well, one thing that it definitely helped with is just like technical skills. I think from actually, building products, working at companies like HubSpot and Segment, um, it helped me as a founder, like build products and move quickly as a startup founder. Obviously, you don't need to work at companies to do that, but that was the path for me to develop those skills and improve those skills. And I think that became very useful as we pursued a startup, especially in such a technical space like Hightouches of the world of data engineering and marketing technology, which are both pretty technical spaces. Um, the other thing I mentioned earlier is just exposure to parts of building a company other than like product and engineering. So I think I didn't get this as much at HubSpot, but I did get it more at Segment, and that leads to something I always tell aspiring founders is like join an early stage startup, see what that's like as it scales, and talk to people all around the company in different divisions, and try to help with more than your core responsibility that you're hired for as much as possible. Because that just gives you a lot of exposure. And frankly, at later stage companies, like when I was interning at HubSpot, they had just gone public. They were, about 800 people. You're a little bit more operating in silos where you don't get to work with sales or work with marketing or really see what the nuts and bolts of building those functions out are. So yeah, I think exposure to other parts of the business, um, and improving my personal skills around like product development and product management as well, was really useful for me. And then last but not least, I would say network.
That's awesome. That's really cool to hear your experience there and how the technical capabilities helped you out there. And can you talk a little bit more about your experience in the early days of High Touch? Was there a turning point for the company where you signed up a big customer? Was how 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 were the early days of that part of the business? Like when did you figure out, okay, this might be working?
Yeah, great question. There were multiple turning points throughout the history of the business, and I think one of the things that's really helped us excel in terms of keeping up a high pace of a company and always like moving to the next thing is just being really attuned to those of like, hey, this is a new type of customer we're serving or a new type of use case or a new type of signal. Is this an edge case or is this going to be a trend? Um, but early on, speaking more to the founding journey, I think that the point where I went, there were 2 points that I realized, like, we're really onto something. The first one was, when we got our 3rd customer at Hightouch. The first 3 customers at Hightouch were in very different industries. We had a SaaS company, we had a D2C company that had a little bit of a healthcare lean, and then we had a newspaper in Norway. Crazy story how we got that customer. Um, but the use cases of each of those 3 companies, like, why they wanted to use Hightouch was the same. They wanted to take all their customer data in data warehouses like Snowflake, and they wanted to use it to personalize their marketing that was happening in systems like HubSpot and Marketo and Salesforce Marketing Cloud. The use case was so similar, even though the companies were so different. And that is what told me that, damn, this must be a big market. If a company in healthcare, if a company in SaaS in Silicon Valley, and if a company that's in, Norwegian newspaper are all looking to use the product for the same reasons, like there probably are a lot of companies looking for this. Um, so that was one point where I was like, I think we're onto something. The second point was when we had launched the online version of High Touch. And within, a day, there were actually like a few companies signing up for the product online. And then within a week, there were over 10 companies signing up for the product online. And that was also another realization because initially, you see these different customers and you're like, okay, there's a pattern here. There must be more companies, but you never really know until you see it happening. So I think about 4 or 5 months later was when I had that second inflection point of conviction.
Interesting. What's the story behind the Norwegian newspaper?
Great question. So when the initial product of Hightouch again sits on top of data warehouses like Snowflake and helps you use that data in business systems. And we thought, who better would know about the demand for this kind of product than the people working at the business systems themselves, like HubSpot. So I interned at HubSpot previously. So again, putting yourself out there, having agency, I sent a cold email to the CTO of HubSpot, Dharmesh, who's very, popular online. It's like million Twitter followers, or I don't know the exact numbers, but he's an influencer in the tech community online. And I asked him if he could share a blog post that we wrote on how to get data into HubSpot's custom objects, which was a new feature they had just released the previous month at their user conference Inbound. And there was no articles online on how to get data into HubSpot custom objects. It was a new feature. And I was like, "We're the easiest way to do it, our startup. Can you post about it online since it's a new product that launched?" And he thought it was exciting, and he did. I barely knew him. I think I ran into him once in a lunch and learn, intern lunch and learn with 20, 30 other people. But I just decided to give it a shot, and he does respond to his email actually. And uh that was shared online. I wouldn't say it got the most engagement, but some salesperson in Europe at HubSpot, because it's a huge company, reshared the post, and their customer asked them, "Hey, I want to try this Hightouch thing that's online." Little that did that customer know that they were going to be one of our first customers ever. But the salesperson at HubSpot reached out to us. You know, it was a partner closed deal if you look at it honestly that way, which is pretty crazy to think, but that's how it came. And then the company in SF, the software company, the SaaS company, was actually Reachable. So it's a pretty popular brand in Silicon Valley. And we got that one through network mostly. Like we're just asking everyone we know for intros to data and marketing roles at various startups. And then the D2C brand was actually through an online data community, just a Slack group of where a bunch of data analysts and engineers were congregating and talking about, hey, what's the best way to move data from the warehouse to the system? Or what's the best way to transfer my data in the warehouse in this way? So finding these three companies that came from very different places and are very different backgrounds as companies and specialties made me feel like, hey, I think we're on to something.
That's awesome. So we talked a little bit about the beginning, the journey of raising money, and even finding the first customers. And now you have a startup that is growing and is doing pretty well. Um, what were some of the biggest challenges that you've encountered running High Touch?
Yeah, great question. So it's super interesting. I think the first challenge that my co-founders and I all encountered was that we needed to focus on management and actually like focus on that as a discipline and like actively reflect and learn how to get better at it. There were some tendencies that we just weren't used to before, like giving people direct feedback, not just telling people like what tasks to do or how they could do certain tasks better, but helping them take a step back and figure out like why do they keep doing it this way? And how can they do it the right way over time? And how can they improve the way they look at the problem or think about the problem? Um, Sometimes just like telling people to do specific things in the way that is right, or like, not letting people wait and make mistakes, but actually like foreseeing them and just like correcting them, putting them on the correct course. Receiving feedback, right? There's like all sorts of things which we just weren't used to, frankly, from like a management perspective. That we hit this stark point when I think we had it was a lot of people at High Touch who were growing quickly. It's probably like 20, 25, 30 people at High Touch, where we're like, hey, I think we need to focus on this as founders. I think it's a deficiency of all of ours. And we need to learn from people around us. We need to learn from the first leaders we're hiring into the company. How are they doing it so well? And how do we steal that superpower and do it ourselves and learn some of these tactics? And yeah, up until that point, honestly, like we had a lot of people, right? 25 people is not an insignificant amount of people, but they were, it was just so clear what the priority is. And we're all running towards the same thing that it was fine that there wasn't a lot of like structure and management and like really active management. But once the company started getting bigger, that was actually essential. And I think that shared understanding that it was an area we needed to get better at as founders was really helpful between the three of us because it also allowed us to give each other like super direct feedback on this topic and be like, oh, I learned this tip, I learned that tip. So that's a big one. The other one was that I think was challenging was marketing. So when we started High Touch, we all wanted to build a company that had like tons of customers like flocking towards it. We didn't want to be just a company where we had to like push the product down people's throats or do cold calls or do sales or outbound all the time. Now it's changed and we're also building out that function on the enterprise side. Obviously, it's a part of scaling the company, but we really envied companies that had a lot of inbound, had people coming to them and had a strong word of mouth. We need to learn like what were creative ways to create that. And honestly, the way we went about that was just like reaching out to tons of startups that we think had that and asking them like what tactics they led to drive it, and then picking some bets, experimenting and trying it here at High Touch. Sales, I would say, was actually a little bit more natural to us as founders when we were initially selling it ourselves. We found that to be quite natural. But what we found to be an interesting learning was when we had to hire salespeople and scale the team, you had to implement a little bit more of a methodology to how they can operate and give them more of like a process and systems. And, there are methodologies online like MedPick and stuff like that that are actually super helpful. And that just wasn't the way we were used to selling and, and operating as founders. We were more shooting from the hip or playing it by ear, or just like naturally succeeding since we're a product and market and customer expert, if that makes sense. So those were three things that really stand out to me.
I'm not surprised that you were so good at sales when you got a job when you were 16 and, hustle all your way to get high touch, first building its product and selling to the first few customers. Yeah, on the management side, I actually talked to Will Larson, who's now CTO of Carta, and he's pretty well known on the engineering community. And his conversation is one of my most popular conversations. And yeah, I've learned a lot talking to him. And I wanted to switch a little bit as well to you talked a little bit about the inbound technique.
Yeah.
So you talked to a lot of startups, experiment yourself. Can you share a little bit of the learnings that you've learned over time?
Yeah, for sure. Happy to share some here. So, I'll actually give a perspective on like what kind of tactics worked for High Touch in the early days on the inbound generating side. So I think we've done a good job at it, and I think there are some like learnings there for aspiring startup founders. So first thing I'll mention is that it's not easy to have inbound for all products. I think there is still a nature of like a product channel fit, channel being like the marketing channel. If you're selling to people who just don't read articles online that much or like SMBs or something like that. It's like probably not an audience where inbound's the right tactic to take. But for a lot of technical products, where buyers are very educated, where there's so many new solutions in the space, where people are always learning about them, it is. So what worked for us? So the first thing we realized was as an early stage startup, no one knew about high touch. So just marketing high touch, talking, trying to build social media following, all that kind of stuff, putting out blog posts. It was going to be very hard for that to get reach. So with any sort of thing we were going to do on the marketing side, the first thing we thought about is like, how are we going to get the reach for this? So the first thing we did is just like figure out where our users live today. Not every startup has it this easy, but at the time that we were getting started at High Touch, there were a lot of communities popping up for data analysts and data engineers around this thing called a modern data stack in companies like Fivetran and DBT and Snowflake, et cetera. So we found these Slack communities, things like DBT's Slack community, or there was another Slack community that wasn't really associated with a company, but was popular called Locally Optimistic, which is like a bunch of data analysts and data engineers gathering together, answering questions, talking about how they're doing different things. So immediately as founders, we started participating in those communities. We started learning the vibe of those communities, right? You can't just like, go talk about your product all the time. You can do Command F in Slack and you can find out places where people actually ask something that's relevant to your product. You can set keyword alerts related to that in Slack to get pinged when topics related to your product come up. They're a bit noisy. They're not always related to your product, but even if 20% of the time it's an actual customer potential, that's huge in the early days. And then you can do a lot to like build educational content that lives on your brand, like hightouch.com, which again, no one's going to at this point. And then share it in those communities as a distribution avenue. If you think that those users are good for your product, if that's your ICP or ideal customer profile and they live there. So that was a big bet for us in the early days. We knew it wouldn't scale as a channel to, millions and millions of revenue, but it was quite valuable to get our foot in the door and to get things off the ground on the marketing side. Another one taking that same principle of like find where your users live today, find where your users' eyeballs are looking at today, was partner marketing. That's what we call it now. Back then, we didn't call it that. We called it, how can we get a bigger company to share high touch? So the HubSpot thing worked very well, right? That was just by coincidence. I had emailed the HubSpot CTO. I'd interned at his super large company, and he shared my thing on LinkedIn. He shared our article about high touch, and boom, we got a customer. It's like, how do we do more of that where they have reach and we don't, but we can make something that's strategic for them to share? Like how to use a new feature of their product and then share something about high touch in there. So we immediately started looking at the company selling to the same persona as us, which was initially data teams. Now it's a lot of marketing teams too, but initially data teams. And companies that were taking off were the ones in that modern data stuff that I mentioned: Fivetran, DBT, Snowflake. Now, quickly we eliminated big companies like Snowflake that had just IPO'd. They're going to be harder to reach, harder to get them to share our content. And the way they sell to customers is huge sales teams and big conferences and stuff that we don't have the time or money for. But Fivetran and DBT both had pretty prolific blogs that data people would read. And, Fivetran in particular was putting out a lot of content, like SEO content, educational content, good content, but it was more like volume of content was something that their marketing team was clearly optimizing for when we looked at their website. Versus DBT was focusing more on like a Substack vibe, posting, niche thought leadership, not as much the SEO. It'd be harder to slip in posts about high touch in there. So we reached out to Fivetran's content marketing team. Well, I got an intro to the founder of Fivetran. Actually just cold emailed him. It was a much smaller company at the time. He responded as well. Um, and he, forwarded it to their content marketing lead. And I was just like, hey, well, what if we wrote more content for you about new things that are picking up in the data market and you just get more traffic from data people as a result, show up on more pages on Google, and we'll actually have some stuff about high touch in there. And he was like, yeah, that's fine. Like high touch and Fivetran are not competitive. Like we're not going to put in the effort to write content on your blog, but we'll let you write content for us. It's like free work. And yeah, we wrote content about things like reverse ETL, which was a category name that we were building around our product at the time. And that content would go out in the newsletter. It would show up in the Fivetran blog. It was ranking a lot higher on things like Google search when we started to care about that, because the number one criteria for what ranks high on Google search is actually the domain authority. That's why Wikipedia always shows up when you search stuff. It's how popular is that domain. Hightouch.com or actually .io at the time was not a popular domain versus something like Fivetran. Didn't have a lot of other sites linking to it. So it immediately starts ranking higher than if you were to publish it yourself. So really the focus was like, don't just do things in your own world. Figure out where are your customers, where are people's eyes and ears right now. Podcasts was another one, and just got on every single data podcast I could think of through a lot of emailing and and talked about high touch and this concept of reverse ETL. And the last thing I would say is that there's distribution. That's most important, honestly, in startups. And then there's positioning. The most important thing for positioning for startups is just for it to be clear, to be honest, just for people to be able to go to the website and don't have a bunch of fluff, make it clear to one type of person, one persona, what exactly you're doing and why they should use you, what problem you solve. Um, but we did something clever, which was we came up with this term, reverse ETL, which was very catchy. And I would say it gave us an added benefit because on all the different places I was talking about, communities, podcasts, blogs with companies like Fivetran, we were using that term and just posting things like, what is reverse ETL? How do you use it? And it sort of started to become a thing. So um, that I wouldn't say is always repeatable. It's maybe not the strategy I would optimize for an early stage startup. Category creation is a more difficult one. But I think what I said about distribution first mindset and really focusing on like, where are my customers looking today is super critical.
That's super interesting. So let's go back to building the company. If you were back to start high touch again, what would you have focused or done differently from the beginning, or have done differently in the process of building the company?
So one thing that immediately comes to mind in terms of like things I would have done differently when building out high touch is um, And I said this earlier during during learnings for other startup founders in building really strong inbound and marketing. But I would say it again because it's a mistake we made. Is it's really important to focus on like one persona at a time as a company. Or actually, I'll rephrase. One big learning that I've had across working on Hightouch is actually that to do a new initiative properly, especially on the go-to-market side, like sales and marketing, etcetera, it really requires a high level of focus. And oftentimes, like when the company is early stage and not a lot's figured out, requires a high level of founder involvement. At least that's my personal perspective. That's no longer true at Hightouch, right? We have initiatives that are, we're over 100 people. We have initiatives that are built by like many teammates under us and leaders of the company. But when the company's early and you're trying to do something new, like outbound sales or enterprise or something that's new and different than what you're doing currently, I think it's really, really important to have a founder just really, really involved in that. Because you can probably imagine that things like your company positioning, product direction, et cetera, are not all baked at the time. And some of the founder intuition of how you reason about those problems is super important. So I think examples in our history, which just didn't really take off before we had a lot of founder involvement, was like figuring out outbound sales. We tried that multiple times at High Touch History without a founder saying this is so important that I'm going to focus on this personally. I think it never got the focus it required, as well as the resources it required, and the attention that it required to really make it successful. So I think we've seen that multiple times in our company history, but that's just something I would warn founders on. Like, it is important to do new things and realize when you need a new lever to grow your business at the pace that's required versus just scale the existing thing. But um, to do something new and something lofty, it often takes like a high amount of focus and patience as well. And if you're not willing to give that level of attention to it because something else is more important, then maybe you can't afford to do those multiple things at once.
That makes sense, and that's super interesting. So let's talk a little bit about reverse ETL and high touch. So you empower companies to actually use a lot of the data that sits on their data warehouse on Snowflake and places like that. And AI has shifted and is helping use a lot of unstructured data. How can AI change the formation and the and also the usage of this of the data and the creation maybe of data apps or and things like that?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, great question. So a couple things. I think there's a lot of talk online about structured versus unstructured data, stuff like that. Frankly, for high touch, we're just expecting that most of a company's data is going to be in some system that's queryable, right? And once that exists, high touch's product can function. We help you take that data and move it to different places where business teams are living out of and doing their job. And now they can do it better with more data. That being said, I do think that AI and machine learning, a lot of people aren't talking about just traditional machine learning, frankly, where I think there's a lot of value in the data space, will greatly affect um, how uh, how companies do some of the tasks they do with high touch today. I'll give an example. A lot of companies are using the high touch product on top of their data warehouse to basically select different customers they want to target with different campaigns in a marketing tool. And what do I mean by this? They're going to the warehouse, they're writing a SQL query or using one of our additional offerings like our customer studio or CDP product that sits directly in the warehouse and gives marketers a user interface that's easy to use to query the customer data that's in Snowflake and finding, okay, I want to target customers who added something to the cart but didn't check it out, or I want to target male customers between these ages. And then they're sending those lists of customers to a tool like Facebook ads or Google ads or Salesforce Marketing Cloud or Iterable to then run a campaign to that audience or list of customers. And what we find is that a lot of, business teams and marketing teams are still doing guesswork as to like, I have this content idea. Who will it resonate in my customer base of 100 million users? That's still a lot of guessing that goes into that. And I think we will see the adoption of more techniques like machine learning to actually determine who's the right person to send different content to and what's the right medium to send it to them and what's the right frequency to remind them of it. And how do I then experiment with the customer on like a one-to-one basis to learn more about them? I think that whole space around targeting is going to get more automated, frankly. And people are doing a lot of manual processes around it today in Hightouch. They're automating manual processes versus rethinking processes in an automatic way. I mean, you already see that in things like Facebook ads and Google ads, right? Those are machines that have been built for the purpose of serving the right content to the right people. I think we're going to see that across, any business domain like email marketing, SMS, et cetera, where people are guessing that stuff manually right now. Um, the other thing I think is that generative AI, combined with technologies like this, will allow people to experiment with a lot more variations of content, et cetera, a lot faster than they can today. Because there's often just like a writing bottleneck or a content bottleneck or a creative bottleneck on trying out new ideas, new campaigns, et cetera, from a marketing team's perspective. We even hit this here at Hightouch. So I think companies like Typeface, Jasper, even just the potential of using like ChatGPT, Midjourney for stuff like this are very exciting because of that content and creative bottleneck that marketing teams often face to try more variants or try more experiments or try more types of campaigns.
That makes sense. One last question. So, how do you see high touch evolving in the next 5 to 10 years? What do you think? How do you think it's going to evolve as a product, and how do you vision the company in 5 years from
Yeah,
now?
great question. So I can't share everything on the product side right now, not long term perspective for multiple reasons. But I would say at a high level, like we started as a data company that's helping people, helping business teams use all the data that exists in tools like Snowflake, Google BigQuery, Databricks in the cloud, right? And that's more of a data tool. It's taking data from the warehouse and bringing it to those business teams and business systems. What we're really thinking about is how does the job of things like marketing that needs a bunch of data, how does that change with more capabilities like data and AI? So as a company, we're not just trying to be a plumbing tool. We've already made the leap over the last couple of years and are just going deeper in terms of roles like marketing or purposes like e-commerce and figuring out how does data and AI really change how people are operating today? For example, from manual targeting to automatic targeting, something we just talked about as an example. Um, so that's something on the product side. On the business side, obviously, we keep growing really fast. We've been focusing on larger, more enterprise customers, working with companies like PetSmart and the NBA and TripAdvisor and many companies you can see on the website, which we've found have a diversity of needs across, data and marketing versus smaller companies and just have a lot more potential when it comes to the value that automation and AI and intelligence can actually provide around their data. There's just a lot more business value that can be produced at those kinds of scales of companies. So yeah, if anyone's interested in joining a company that is growing super fast in the intersection of data and AI and marketing technology, then definitely reach out because we're actively hiring and building a ton of interesting stuff here.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time. This was really, really interesting. I've learned a ton. I hope the audience learns a ton too. Where can people find you online and find more about high touch and maybe the career opportunities that you have?
Yeah. So for more about High Touch, hightouch.com. It's kind of like high five. So, HIGH and then touch. Um, and we have a careers page on the website. I think it's just slash careers. More about myself. I'm on LinkedIn, Twitter. My username on all platforms is just my first and last name. So Tejas, Tejas Manohar, or you could search Tejas High Touch. So yeah, catch me around and let me know if I can help with anything.
All right. Thank you, Tejas. Have an awesome day.